The gavel cracked against wood with a sound no louder than a twig snapping underfoot. Yet that small, sharp noise shattered the entire frame of Eleanor Holbrook's world. She felt the vibration not in her ears, but through the worn soles of her boots. A tremor traveling up from the courthouse floorboards into her bones, into the hollow space behind her ribs where her heart used to beat with hope. It was done. The farm, the house her husband had built board by board with his calloused hands. The soil that held his sweat and now held his body beneath the old oak tree on the hill. All of it belonged to the bank. Eleanor stood motionless in the courtroom. Her spine remained straight despite the weight pressing down on her shoulders. A weight that felt heavier than all the earth in Montana. Heavier than the limestone that had buried Silas 8 months ago. Heavier than the silence that had filled their home ever since. Behind her, she could hear the soft shuffle of her children on the wooden bench. Gideon sat with his arm wrapped around his little sister Cora. The boy was 13 years old. His jaw was set in that hard way he had learned in the months since his father died. Too hard for a child his age. Too necessary for the man he was being forced to become. Cora had just turned 6 3 weeks ago. There had been no birthday celebration. There had been nothing to celebrate. The little girl pressed against her brother's side, her small fingers clutching the fabric of his shirt. Her eyes were wide and confused. She did not understand what was happening. She only understood that the world had become a frightening place where fathers disappeared and mothers stopped smiling. At their feet lay Bramble. The border collie had his ears pressed flat against his skull. His brown eyes watched Eleanor with an intensity that bordered on human understanding. The dog had not made a sound since they entered this building of polished wood and cold justice. Animals always understood things that humans tried to hide from themselves. The man across the table slid a single folded document toward her. His name was Orson Finch. He wore a tidy mustache, and his fingernails were so clean they seemed merciless against the ink-stained pages of debt and default. His face held no particular cruelty, which somehow made everything worse. He was simply doing his job. Her complete ruin was merely paperwork to him. Another file to close before lunch. The document was not a reprieve. It was a deed to the last remnant of the Holbrook Holdings, a sliver of limestone badlands on the county's western edge, land deemed worthless for grazing, worthless for farming, worthless for anything except holding the territory together on a surveyor's map. Its only distinguishing feature was a cave, a dark mouth in the rock that most considered a liability, a wound in the earth that decreased the property's value to nearly nothing. Finch offered it as settlement of the final accounts, a gesture that cost the bank nothing and gave her less than that. Eleanor reached out and took the paper. Its crispness felt like an insult against her calloused fingers. She had $2.17 remaining in this world, a small, cold weight in her pocket that would have to stretch across a lifetime that suddenly seemed very short indeed. She did not look back at her children. She could not bear to see their faces. Outside the courthouse, the October air carried the first sharp bite of approaching winter. The townspeople who had gathered to watch the proceedings stood in small clusters on the wooden steps. Their voices dropped to whispers as she emerged through the heavy doors. They did not meet her eyes. Their pity hung around her like a suffocating blanket, and she wanted nothing more than to tear it away from her skin and leave it crumpled on the ground behind her. Widow, unlanded, a ghost in the making. She was 38 years old, and the world had already decided she was finished. Eleanor walked down the courthouse steps without looking back. The sound of her boot heels on the boards was steady and deliberate. Each step was a refusal to crumble. Each footfall was a small act of defiance against the verdict that had just been passed. Bramble fell into step beside her. His paws were silent on the dusty street, his loyalty unquestioning. Gideon followed with Cora's small hand gripped tight in his own. The little girl's shoes made soft, uncertain sounds as she struggled to keep pace. Her brother slowed without being asked. He had learned to anticipate needs in these past months. He had learned to fill gaps that should not have existed. The rhythm of their footsteps was the only music left to accompany them into whatever came next. 8 months earlier, life had worn a different face. Not easy. Life on a Montana homestead was never easy. But there had been warmth in the farmhouse kitchen when the winter winds howled outside. There had been laughter around the dinner table when Silas told his stories. Stories about his father who had first claimed this land. Stories about the wild years before the railroad came. Stories that made Gideon's eyes grow wide and Cora giggle with delight. There had been love in the small moments between the endless work. There had been Silas. Her husband had been a big man with hands that could gentle a spooked horse or split a cord of wood before breakfast. The kind of man who filled a doorway when he stood in it. The kind of man whose absence left a hole in the air itself. He had built their home board by board and nail by nail, working through 2 brutal winters until the walls stood straight and true against everything the Montana sky could throw at them. He had dug the well himself, cleared the fields himself, raised the barn with help from neighbors who no longer remembered his name. But the farm had struggled despite his efforts. Bad weather 3 years running, harvests that barely covered the seed cost, prices that dropped just when they needed to sell, debt that accumulated like snow in a drift. Each year worse than the last. Each spring a fresh gamble against long odds. Then his mother Edna had fallen ill. The doctor bills had piled up like more snow, blocking every door, burying every hope. Edna Holbrook had been more than a mother-in-law to Eleanor. She had been a teacher, a confidant, a second mother when Eleanor's own had passed years before. The old woman had come to America from Bavaria as a young bride. She had survived the journey west, survived the early years of hardship, survived the death of her own husband 20 years ago. Her weathered hands had guided Eleanor through 100 household tasks. How to preserve vegetables so they lasted through the coldest months. How to read coming weather in the color of clouds. How to stretch a single meal to feed unexpected guests without anyone leaving hungry. How to find strength when strength seemed impossible. They had spent countless evenings together by lamplight. Edna's voice soft and patient as she shared the accumulated wisdom of her 67 years. German remedies passed down through generations, prayers that had sustained her through her own hardships, stories of the old country that Eleanor would never forget. When the sickness came for Edna, it came slowly at first. A cough that would not clear, a weakness in the legs, a shortness of breath that made climbing stairs an ordeal. The doctor from town came out 3 times. He prescribed medicines that cost more than the farm made in a month. He shook his head with that particular expression doctors use when they have run out of hope but cannot bring themselves to say so. Silas had taken work at the stone quarry 15 miles east. He left before dawn each morning, his lunch pail in one hand, his battered hat in the other. He returned after dark with gray dust in his hair and exhaustion carved into every line of his face. He never complained. That was not his way. The quarry paid better than anything else in the county. Hard, dangerous work that younger men avoided when they could. But Silas took it because the money was needed, because his mother was dying, because his wife and children depended on him, because that was what a man did. The last morning Eleanor saw him alive had started like any other. She had risen before first light to prepare his breakfast. Coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, biscuits with the last of the bacon grease, 2 eggs from their remaining hens. A meal that would carry him through 12 hours of breaking rock. Silas had stood in the kitchen doorway with that lunch pail in one hand and his hat in the other. Early light slanted through the window and caught the silver threads beginning to show at his temples. He was 42 years old, still strong, still capable, but the years of labor had begun their patient work of wearing him down. Gideon had been eating breakfast at the worn wooden table, his legs still too short to touch the floor, his face still soft with the roundness of boyhood. Silas had ruffled the boy's hair with rough affection. When we pay off this debt, he had said, I am going to teach you to ride proper. We will go up into the high country together. Just the 2 of us. See if we cannot find some elk. Gideon had nodded solemnly, trying to look like a man, though his chin barely cleared the tabletop. Silas had crossed the kitchen then. He had kissed Eleanor on the forehead. His lips were warm. His hand lingered on her shoulder. She remembered thinking she should tell him to be careful, but the words seemed unnecessary. He was always careful. He would come home that evening, same as every other evening, tired and dusty but whole. Bramble had trotted after him to the gate, same as every morning. The dog always waited there until Silas disappeared over the ridge, then returned to the house to begin his daily patrol of the property, checking the chicken coop, circling the barn, watching for anything that might threaten his family. The quarry collapsed at 2 o'clock that afternoon. Eleanor was stirring a pot of soup on the stove. The kitchen was warm with steam and the smell of onions. Edna was resting in the back room. Cora was playing with a corn husk doll on the floor. Gideon was reading from his school book at the table. Then she heard Brambles howl from the yard. Not his usual bark at a passing rabbit or distant coyote. This was something else entirely. A sound of pure animal grief that raised the hair on her arms and stopped her heart mid-beat. The dog had known. Across all those miles he had felt it somehow. He had sensed the moment when Silas ceased to exist in this world. He had announced it with a howl that echoed off the hills and filled the valley with sorrow. Eleanor did not remember dropping the pot. She only remembered the scald of hot water across her feet and the way the world had tilted sideways and refused to right itself no matter how hard she gripped the edge of the counter. 3 men came from town an hour later, their faces gray with dust and something worse, their hats crushed in their hands. 3 men dead in the collapse, they said. Silas Holbrook and 2 others, buried under tons of limestone that would take days to clear. The foreman had tears running down his weathered face when he delivered the news. Silas Holbrook was the best man I ever worked with. I am so sorry. They buried Silas beside his father beneath the oak tree on the hill overlooking the farm. The tree had been planted by Silas's grandfather 50 years ago. It had witnessed 3 generations of Holbrooks being laid to rest in its shade. Eleanor had stood at the grave with her children pressed against her sides, watching the dirt fall on the pine box, feeling something inside her chest turn to cold, heavy stone. Gideon had not cried. His face was a mask of control that no boy his age should have to wear. Cora had cried enough for both of them, her small body shaking with sobs she did not understand. Bramble had lain beside the grave for 3 days. He refused food, refused water, refused to move from the spot where his master had been lowered into the earth. On the 4th day, he finally rose. He walked slowly back to the house. He took up his position on the porch, and he waited. He was still waiting, 8 months later, for a man who would never return. 3 months after Silas died, Edna finally lost her fight. The old woman had seemed to shrink after her son's death, as if grief was slowly consuming her from within. She stopped eating, stopped rising from her bed most days. The light in her eyes grew dim and distant. That sharp German intelligence that had guided Eleanor through so many difficulties faded like a candle burning down to nothing. In her final hours, fever stole most of her words, but she had summoned strength from somewhere deep within, clutching Eleanor's hand with surprising force, her eyes suddenly clear and urgent. The western land, she had whispered. The cave. Silas knew. He was going to show you. He said there was something there, something that could save you if the worst ever came. Then her eyes had fluttered closed, her grip had loosened, and she was gone. Eleanor had sat beside the empty body for a long time, holding a hand that would never squeeze back, left with a mystery she did not understand. Now standing in the October chill outside the courthouse, she finally understood. Silas had known about the cave. He had explored it, studied it, seen something in that worthless land that no one else could see. He had been waiting for the right moment to share his discovery, waiting until the debt was paid and they had time to plan properly. He had run out of time, but he had left her a clue. The journey to collect their belongings was the longest walk of Eleanor's life. The house that was no longer hers stood quiet in the slanting afternoon light. Everything looked exactly the same as it had that morning. The curtains she had sewn hanging in the windows, the rocking chair on the porch where she had nursed both children, the marks on the kitchen door frame where she had measured their height each birthday. None of it belonged to her anymore. The bank did not want these small personal items. They wanted the land, the buildings, the livestock that had already been sold at auction to pay the most pressing debts. The worn quilts and chipped dishes were beneath their notice. Eleanor moved through the rooms like a woman walking through her own funeral. She gathered what she could carry: a cast-iron skillet blackened by years of use, seasoned with 1,000 family meals, a wool blanket that still held the faint scent of cedar, and something else she refused to name, a small axe with a worn handle, a sack of dried beans, Silas's oil lantern dented and faithful, a wooden crate containing 3 nervous chickens who clucked their confusion at being disturbed. Gideon helped without speaking. He was old enough to understand what was happening, old enough to feel the full weight of it pressing down on his young shoulders. His movements were careful and deliberate. He wrapped the breakable things. He stacked the heavy things. He did not ask questions because there were no answers that would change anything. Cora did not understand. She wandered through the empty rooms, asking questions that had no answers. Where are we going, Mama? When are we coming back? Why does the house feel so sad? Eleanor could not bring herself to explain. She simply gathered her daughter close and held her for a long moment, breathing in the smell of her hair, feeling the warmth of her small body, drawing strength from the contact. The hardest moment came at the front door. Eleanor stood with her hand on the smooth, familiar wood of the latch. Her palm knew every groove and wear mark in that brass plate. For 10 years, this door had been the threshold between her world and everything else, the boundary between safety and uncertainty, home in the vast unknown. Now it was just a door, someone else's door. She pulled it shut. The quiet click echoed with a finality that matched the gavel's crack. The sound sealed her past away, locked it behind wood and glass and memories she could not afford to carry. She stood under that vast, indifferent sky with nothing but a worthless deed and a future as barren as the land it described. They walked 8 miles before sunset. The town fell away behind them. Neat fences and plowed fields gave way to rougher country. The dirt road became a track, then a path, then nothing at all. They navigated by landmarks Silas had mentioned in passing conversations she was only now remembering. Past the lightning-split pine, through the gap in the red rock ridge, follow the dry creek bed until it bends north. She had not realized how much she had absorbed from his casual descriptions, how much she had stored away without knowing she might someday need it. Silas had been planning this. Even before he died, he had been giving her a map in pieces, preparing her for a future he must have sensed approaching. The thought was both comforting and unbearable. Gideon carried Cora on his back for the last 2 miles when her small legs refused to go any further. The boy did not complain. He simply knelt in the dust, let his sister climb on, and kept walking. His face was pale with exhaustion, but his jaw remained set. He was his father's son. Bramble ranged ahead of them along the trail, then circled back to check their progress, then ranged ahead again. The dog's ears swiveled constantly, alert to sounds the humans could not hear. He kept looking back at Eleanor with those intelligent brown eyes, as if waiting for her to turn around, to lead them back to the life they had known. She did not turn around. The sun was bleeding orange and purple across the jagged silhouette of the distant mountains when they finally reached the property line. A single rust-colored iron stake driven into the rocky ground marked the boundary. Someone had hammered it there decades ago, claiming land that no one else wanted. The light painted everything in shades of ending. The land was exactly as worthless as its reputation suggested. Gray rock jutted from the thin soil like broken teeth. Gnarled skeletal bushes were the only vegetation, their leaves already withered to brown paper that rattled in the evening breeze. The ground was more stone than dirt, hostile to any seed foolish enough to try taking root. And there at the base of a low, crumbling escarpment was the cave. Its mouth gaped dark and wide in the rock face, a silent howl of surprise carved into the cliff. The opening stretched broad enough for a wagon but low enough that a tall man would need to duck his head. Beyond the entrance, darkness swallowed everything. Absolute, complete, impenetrable. A cold draft breathed outward from those depths, carrying a scent of damp stone and ancient stillness. It smelled like a place that had been waiting for a very long time, waiting for someone desperate enough to enter. This was her inheritance. This was her refuge. The thought was so bleak, so completely devoid of hope, that a dry, humorless laugh escaped Eleanor's lips. The sound was swallowed immediately by the immense quiet of the Badlands, as if the land itself found nothing amusing about her situation. She set down her belongings. The chickens clucked nervous protests in their crate. Cora pressed closer to her brother's leg, her eyes wide as she stared at the dark opening. Gideon's hand found the small knife at his belt, a gesture that was becoming habit. "Mama," Cora said, her voice barely louder than the wind, "is this where we live now?" Eleanor looked at the cave, looked at the barren land surrounding it, looked at the last golden light fading from a sky that did not care whether they survived the night. "Yes," she said, "for now." She could not bring herself to say more. The first night was a vigil of fear. Eleanor built a small fire near the cave's entrance, gathering dry brush and dead branches from the surrounding scrubland. The meager flames pushed back the darkness by a few precious feet, creating a small pocket of warmth against the vast, cold night. She rationed out a handful of dried beans for each of them, cooked in water from the canteen she had filled before leaving town. The blandness was fitting for their new circumstances. Cora ate without complaint, too exhausted to fuss. Her small body curled against Bramble's warmth. The dog had positioned himself beside her without being asked. He understood his job now. Protect the young ones. Keep them safe through whatever was coming. Gideon chewed mechanically, his eyes fixed on the fire, his thoughts somewhere far away, perhaps in the high country where his father had promised to take him, perhaps under the oak tree where his father now lay. Later, wrapped in the single wool blanket, Eleanor lay on the hard ground and watched the stars emerge overhead. The same constellations she had taught Gideon to name when he was small enough to fit in her lap. The Big Dipper, Orion's Belt, the North Star that Silas had used to navigate home on dark nights. But here those familiar patterns offered no comfort. They were just points of light scattered across an endless, empty blackness, cold and impossibly distant, indifferent to one woman's grief and two children's fear. Every scrape of stone in the darkness made her flinch. Every rustle of wind through the dry brush was a potential threat. The night sounds of the Badlands were foreign and frightening after years of knowing exactly which creature made which noise on her own land. But the greatest threat was not outside. It lived inside her own mind. The cold, heavy certainty that she had been sent here to die. That the cave looming behind her was a tomb waiting to receive her body and the bodies of her children. That the world had cast them out, erased them from the community of warmth and human society, left them to expire on a piece of land that was itself a testament to worthlessness. She did not sleep that night. She watched the fire burn down to embers, watched the embers fade to white ash, watched the first gray light of dawn dilute the darkness in the eastern sky. Morning arrived not with a gentle sunrise, but as a slow, reluctant brightening. The world resolved itself into shades of brown and gray. The air was bitter with the promise of coming frost. Eleanor sat up, her body stiff and aching from the hard ground. She was still alive. The fact registered as a small, hard kernel of surprise in her chest. She had half expected the night to swallow her whole, to wake up and find herself somewhere else, or to not wake up at all. Gideon was awake too. The boy sat with his back against a boulder, his eyes fixed on the cave entrance, his hand still resting on the knife at his belt. He had been keeping watch, a 13-year-old boy standing guard over his family because there was no one else left to do it. Something cracked inside Eleanor's chest. Not grief this time. Something harder and sharper. Something with edges that could cut through despair if she let it. She climbed to her feet. It was time to see what Silas had found. The lantern's golden glow was a fragile weapon against the profound darkness within. Eleanor stepped through the cave entrance with Bramble padding silently at her heels. The dog's nose worked constantly, reading scents that human senses could never detect. His ears pricked forward, alert but not alarmed. That was a good sign. If danger lurked in these depths, Bramble would know before she did. She had told Gideon to stay outside with Cora. The boy wanted to argue. She could see it in his eyes, but something in her face had silenced him. This was something she needed to do alone, at least the first time. The cave's opening was low and wide, but the passage quickly narrowed as she moved deeper. The limestone walls pressed close on either side, slick with a film of moisture that glittered in the lamplight like scattered diamonds. The air grew heavy, still, noticeably cooler than the night had been outside. It felt like walking into the belly of some great sleeping beast. Each step took her further from daylight, further from the world she knew, deeper into the unknown heart of the earth. For the first 50 feet, the cave was simply a tunnel. The floor was uneven, packed earth mixed with fallen rock that threatened to turn her ankle if she moved too quickly. She saw evidence of animals that had sheltered here in the past. Old droppings scattered in corners, a few bones picked clean by scavengers, too old to identify. But the space was empty now. Whatever creatures had once called this place home had moved on long ago. Despair began to settle over her like a familiar weight. This was no shelter. This was a hole, a damp, dark, lifeless hole in the rock. She had been a fool to come here. A fool to imagine anything other than a slow, cold end for herself and her children. The townspeople had been right to mock her. The bankers had been right to take everything. She was nothing but a foolish woman, following a dead man's half-remembered words into oblivion. The walls pressed closer. The ceiling dropped lower. She had to crouch, then nearly crawl. The lantern held out before her like an offering to the indifferent darkness. But she did not stop. Something drove her forward. The same stubbornness that had kept her spine straight in the courthouse. The same refusal to simply lie down and surrender that had carried her through the deaths of her husband and mother-in-law and the loss of everything she had ever known. If this cave was to be her grave, she would at least see all of it first. Then the tunnel began to open. The ceiling rose away from her reaching fingers. The walls retreated into shadows beyond the lantern's reach. Eleanor stood upright, holding the light higher, and felt its glow swallowed by an immense volume of empty space. She had stepped into a cathedral of stone. The chamber stretched before her, its true dimensions hidden in darkness, its ceiling lost somewhere far above. The floor was relatively flat here, scattered with loose rock and patches of clay, but mostly navigable. The air was different in this space, cleaner somehow, less stagnant, as if the cave itself was breathing. And then she heard it, a sound so soft she almost missed it beneath her own heartbeat and the blood rushing in her ears. Drip, 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 steady, patient, rhythmic as a pulse. It was the most reassuring sound she had heard in months. Following the echo, she found a place where the rock wall wept, a slow, constant seep of water, clear and cold, trickling down the limestone face and collecting in a shallow basin worn into the stone floor. The basin was perhaps 2 feet across, its edges smoothed by centuries of patient erosion. Water pooled there, still and clean, reflecting her lantern light like a mirror to another world. Eleanor knelt beside it. She cupped her hands and drank. The water was sweet and pure, filtered through 100 feet of limestone, carrying minerals that tingled on her tongue, cold enough to make her teeth ache, delicious beyond anything she had ever tasted, because it meant survival. A spring, an underground spring that flowed year-round, protected from drought and flood alike, immune to the freezing temperatures that would soon grip the land above. This water would not ice over in winter. This water would not run dry in summer. This water would sustain life in any season. This water was hope. Bramble lapped at the basin beside her, his tail moving in what might have been the first wag since they left the farmhouse. Then as she knelt there mesmerized by the miracle of clean water in a barren land, the quality of light around her changed. A pale ethereal beam pierced the darkness from somewhere high above. Eleanor looked up, craning her neck, following the light to its source. High in the cavern ceiling, barely visible against the black rock, was a fissure, a long, narrow crack that opened to the sky far above. Through it, a shaft of morning sunlight streamed down into the heart of the mountain, illuminating a circle of floor in the center of the chamber. She stepped into that beam. Warmth touched her face. The light fell around her shoulders like a blessing, like a hand reaching down from heaven to say, here, right here, this is where you begin again. For several hours each day, as the sun tracked across the sky overhead, this chamber would be bathed in direct natural light. The geometry of the crack and the Earth's rotation meant growing seasons would have illumination. Not as much as an open field beneath full sky, but enough, possibly enough. The air in the chamber was still and calm. The massive limestone walls absorbed fluctuations from the outside world and held everything within at a constant temperature. Not warm exactly, not cold either. Simply stable, unchanging. A pocket of constancy in a world of brutal extremes. This was not a tomb. This was a fortress. This was a machine for survival, powered by geology and light and water and time. And then Eleanor saw something that stopped her breath entirely. Near the base of the far wall, tucked into a crevice at shoulder height, was a piece of folded paper. She crossed the chamber on legs that trembled. Her fingers shook as she pulled the paper free from its hiding place. The page was yellowed and creased from being folded and refolded. But the handwriting was unmistakable. She knew every loop and angle of those letters. She had seen them on shopping lists and love notes in the deed to their farm. It was Silas's handwriting, water at 50 paces from entrance. The note read, light at center from crack above, temperature stable year-round, warmer than outside in winter, cooler in summer. Good soil can be brought inside. This could work. We could grow food here if we had to. Eleanor's knees buckled. She sank to the stone floor with the note pressed against her chest, and something that had been locked tight in items finally broke open. Her shoulders shook. Her breath came in ragged gasps. The sound that escaped her throat was half grief and half something else entirely. He had known. Silas had known about this place. He had explored it, studied it, recognized its potential. He had been planning to show her, to explain his idea, to share this secret hope that might save them if everything else failed. He had run out of time, but he had left her a message. He had left her a map. He had left her, even in death, exactly what she needed to survive. The idea took root in that moment of grief and revelation. It was an impossible idea. A farmer's dream in a place where nothing was supposed to grow. Planting a crop inside the earth itself. Raising food in the darkness where no plow had ever turned soil. Madness. Everyone would call it madness. But Silas had believed it could work. He had studied this place, made calculations, written those words in his careful hand. This could work. She trusted him. She had trusted him with her life for 15 years. She would trust him now even though he was gone. She would trust his knowledge and his judgment and the love that had driven him to search for any way to protect his family. Standing in the beam of sunlight in the heart of the mountain, Eleanor Holbrook made her decision. She would plant corn in this cave. She would grow food in the darkness. She would prove everyone wrong or she would die trying. It was an act of rebellion against the verdict the world had passed on her and on this land. It was defiance made tangible. For the first time since that gavel cracked against wood in the courthouse, a feeling other than grief or fear stirred within her chest. It was a sliver of something hard and sharp and bright. It was resolve. She climbed back through the narrow passage to the outside world. The daylight seemed harsh after the soft glow of the cavern, but it was also warm and real and full of possibility that had not existed an hour ago. Gideon stood waiting at the entrance. Cora was still asleep against Bramble's side. The dog lifted his head as Eleanor emerged. His tail wagged once, twice. The boy's face was tight with worry. What did you find? Eleanor held up the folded paper. Silas's note, the last gift he would ever give her. Hope, she said. I found hope. Gideon's eyes moved from the paper to his mother's face. Something shifted in his expression. The hard mask cracked just slightly, letting through a glimmer of the boy he had been before the world fell apart. He nodded once. Tell me what to do, he said. Eleanor looked at her son, at this child who had become her partner in survival, at this boy who was willing to follow her into madness because there was nowhere else to go. She looked at the cave behind her, at the barren land surrounding them, at the vast indifferent sky above. Then she looked back at Gideon. We are going to plant, she said. We are going to grow. We are going to live. The words hung in the cold morning air, and somewhere in the distance a bird began to sing. The work began with the most fundamental element, soil. The floor of the great chamber was mostly stone and clay, unsuitable for cultivation. The thin, scraggly topsoil outside was barely worthy of the name, but it was all she had to work with. The labor would be brutal. She knew this before she lifted the first handful. She did it anyway. Eleanor used the cast-iron skillet as a makeshift spade, its weight and edge capable of scraping dirt from between rocks. The empty bean sack became her carrier. Each morning before the sun climbed high enough to send light into the cave, she would work the scrubland outside, filling the sack handful by handful, spoonful by spoonful, patiently gathering what the hard land grudgingly surrendered. The sack, when full, became a dead weight that pulled at her shoulders. She had to drag it across the rocky ground, had to haul it through the narrow throat of the cave entrance, had to carry it 50 feet through darkness to the chamber where the light would fall, then return for another load, and another, and another. Her back screamed in protest. Her hands, once merely calloused from farm work, were soon raw, then blistered, then hardened into thick, leathery pads that cracked and bled and healed and cracked again. The first week she managed to create a patch of soil in the sunlit circle no larger than her blanket. a dark smear on the cavern floor that looked pathetic, insignificant. A child's attempt at farming, but it was a beginning. Gideon joined her on the third day. The boy had watched her work in silence for 2 full days, asking no questions, his face unreadable. On the morning of the third day, without being asked, he picked up a second container and began hauling soil beside her. He did not speak. Neither did she. There was nothing that needed saying. They worked. The rhythm of labor became their language. The scrape of metal against rock. The grunt of lifting. The shuffle of feet through darkness. The thump of soil being dumped onto the growing pile. These sounds replaced conversation. These motions replaced grief. There was something almost holy about it. The way physical exhaustion could silence the mind. The way aching muscles could crowd out aching hearts. The way sweat and strain could transform despair into something that felt almost like purpose. Cora helped in her own way. The little girl took over care of the chickens, feeding them scraps, collecting the eggs they produced. She named each hen with the seriousness of someone bestowing titles of nobility. Marigold for the golden brown one, the bossy one who always ate first. Biscuit for the speckled one, the gentle one who let Cora hold her. Pepper for the small fierce one with dark feathers, the one who pecked at anyone who came too close to the nest. She talked to them in the high, sweet voice of a child, and the birds clucked back as if they understood every word. Perhaps they did. Perhaps in this strange new world, anything was possible. Bramble watched over them all. The dog appointed himself guardian of the family's new territory, patrolling the cave entrance at regular intervals, sleeping beside Cora each night, following Eleanor through the passages as she worked. His presence was a comfort beyond measure, a living reminder that loyalty still existed in the world. Deeper in the cave system, Eleanor discovered another resource: bat droppings. The smell was powerful enough to make her eyes water. But she remembered something Edna had once said about fertilizer, about how farmers in the old country used every scrap of organic matter to enrich their soil, about how waste could become wealth in the right hands. The ancient deposits had accumulated over decades, perhaps centuries, forming dark piles in the deeper chambers where the bats roosted in summer. She spent days scraping the dried waste from cave floors and walls, mixing it into the soil she had labored so hard to gather. Filthy work, degrading work, the kind of work that would have made the ladies in town gasp and turn away in disgust. Eleanor no longer cared what anyone in town thought about anything. She was building something, creating something from nothing, fighting for her children's lives with nothing but her hands and her will and the knowledge her dead husband had left behind. By the end of the first month, she had constructed 3 long raised beds of rich, dark earth. Each bed was positioned precisely within the path the daily sunbeam would trace across the chamber floor. 8 feet long, 2 feet wide, 10 inches deep, over 200 trips through darkness, carrying load after load until her shoulders burned and her legs trembled and her vision blurred with exhaustion. The physical cost was immense. Every muscle in her body ached. Her joints creaked like old hinges when she moved. At night, she collapsed onto her blanket, too spent to even build a fire, welcoming the cave's darkness as relief from the strain of endless labor. She ate sparingly, rationing the beans, knowing that her survival depended on a harvest that was still nothing more than a desperate gamble. But something fundamental had shifted. The cave was no longer a place of exile. It was a workshop, a laboratory, a sanctuary. It was home. The trip to town was a necessity she dreaded. She needed seed corn. She needed lamp oil. Her supplies were running dangerously low and the planting window was slipping away with every day that passed. If she waited too long, even the protected environment of the cave might not be enough. Eleanor left Gideon in charge of Cora and Bramble, gave him careful instructions, and walked the 8 miles back to Cooperton alone. The town looked the same as it always had, the same storefronts with their painted signs, the same horses tied to hitching posts along the main street, the same women in their clean-pressed dresses walking between the mercantile and the church. But it felt different to her now. Or perhaps she was the one who had changed. The rhythms of commerce and gossip seemed frivolous now, disconnected from the fundamental realities of water and soil and shelter that governed her existence. These people worried about the price of fabric and the scandal at the mill. She worried about whether her children would see spring. The bell above the door of Brenner's General Store rang with its usual cheerful jingle as she pushed through. The sound felt entirely out of place. Harlan Brenner stood behind the counter, a man whose spine seemed made of the same rigid wood as his shelves. He looked up as she entered, and a flicker of surprise crossed his face before he could school his features into merchant neutrality. He had probably expected never to see her again. Eleanor walked to the counter. Her dress was worn and stained with cave dirt. The soil beneath her fingernails stood in stark contrast to the store's orderly displays of goods and bolts of clean fabric. "I need seed corn," she said. Her voice was rough from disuse. "And a gallon of lamp oil." Brenner raised an eyebrow. "Planning this late, Mrs. Holbrook. First frost is due any week now." His tone carried no kindness. It was the voice of a man confirming his own assumptions. Just then the door opened and another customer entered. Vernon Sutfield. He was a farmer who owned land bordering what had once been Holbrook property. A man of 52 years with weathered skin and opinions about everything. The kind of man who believed his success proved his wisdom. The kind of man who saw other people's failures as confirmation of their weakness. He had wanted the Holbrook land for years, had made offers to Silas that were more insult than negotiation, had been waiting, some said, for exactly this moment. He saw Eleanor and stopped in the doorway. A slow, spreading smile crossed his face. The smile of a man about to enjoy himself at someone else's expense. He leaned against a barrel of pickles and folded his thick arms across his chest. "Well, well, well," he drawled loud enough for everyone in the store to hear. "Still kicking, I see. Heard you were living in that old cave out on the western edge. Figured a rock slide might have saved you the trouble of facing winter." Laughter rippled through the store, quiet but unmistakable. Eleanor kept her eyes on Brenner. She would not give Sutfield the satisfaction of her response. The corn, she repeated, and the oil. Brenner made a show of weighing out the seeds, his movements deliberately slow, designed to prolong her time in the store. Time for others to see her reduced circumstances. Time for the whispers to build. A young man near the back of the store laughed openly. Clem Jessup, barely 24, the kind of person who found cruelty entertaining because he had never experienced it himself. What is she going to grow in a cave, rocks? Maybe she should try mushrooms. That would make more sense. More snickers. Someone whispered something she could not quite hear. More laughter followed. An older woman near the fabric bolts shook her head with theatrical pity. Patience Sutfield, Vernon's wife, a woman who collected gossip like other women collected china. Poor thing, she said to no one in particular. Lost her husband, lost her home, now losing her mind. Someone should inform Reverend Whitmore. This is not natural behavior. The humiliation burned across Eleanor's cheeks like a brand, but she met it with a cold stillness she had cultivated in the darkness of the cave. She had hauled tons of earth with her bare hands. She had slept on stone and eaten scraps and worked until her body screamed for mercy. A few stinging words were nothing. She placed her coins on the counter. The sound of metal on wood was sharp and final. She took the sack of seed and the can of oil. As she turned toward the door, she paused. For the first time, she looked directly at Vernon Sutfield. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the murmurs like a blade through fog. A person has to plant where they can. She did not wait for a response. The bell jingled her departure, and she left behind a silence heavy with smug certainty that she would fail. The mockery was a fire in her belly as she walked home. But it was not destructive fire. It was fuel. They saw a mad, grieving widow making foolish choices. They had no idea they were looking at a farmer about to begin the most important season of her life. Back in the sanctuary of the cave, the insults faded to irrelevance. The air inside was still and cool, carrying the clean scent of damp earth and ancient stone. It washed away the dust and judgment of the world outside. In here, only the work mattered, only the soil and the seeds and the thin hope they represented. Eleanor laid out the kernels of corn on a flat stone. Small, hard golden promises, each one a potential plant, each one a tiny gamble against overwhelming odds. She began to plant. The work was meticulous, a ritual of hope performed in the heart of living rock. She pressed each seed into the dark, rich soil of the raised beds. spacing them with the practiced care of a lifetime spent working the land. Her fingers knew this motion. Her body remembered the rhythms of planting even here underground in a place where no crop had ever been sown. She was not just planting food. She was planting a future. She was planting defiance. Gideon helped, following her instructions without question, learning by watching as she had once learned from her own mother. His young hands pressed seeds into the earth with growing confidence. Cora helped too, pressing seeds into the dirt with small, careful fingers, treating it like a game because she was too young to understand the stakes. "We are putting them to bed, Mama," the little girl said. "They will sleep and then wake up as corn." "Yes," Eleanor whispered. "That is exactly right." Old Matthias Gruber came to visit 3 days after planting. He was a German immigrant, 78 years old, living in a small cabin on the outskirts of town. Most people avoided him. They said he was strange, that he talked to himself, that he had peculiar ideas about things that proper people did not discuss. Eleanor had spoken to him only a handful of times before. Brief exchanges at the mercantile, nods of acknowledgement on the street, nothing more. He appeared at the cave entrance one afternoon, leaning heavily on a gnarled walking stick, his white beard tangled with bits of leaf and twig. Bramble growled softly in warning but did not bark, as if the bow sensed something trustworthy in this odd visitor. "I heard what you are doing," the old man said. His accent was thick, his English rough but clear. "They say in town that you have lost your mind, planting crops in a cave." Eleanor stood in the entrance, blocking his view of the interior. "What do you want?" Matthias smiled. It was a kind smile full of gaps where teeth had been, but warm with genuine interest. "In Bavaria, where I grew up, we had caves too. My grandmother stored vegetables in them all winter. 55 degrees always, summer and winter. The earth keeps its own temperature." He tapped his walking stick against the rock. "Everyone here thinks they know everything. They do not. The old ways work when the new ways fail." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small cloth bag. "Wood ash," he said, pressing it into her hands. "Mix it into your soil. It will help the corn grow stronger." Then he turned and shuffled away without another word, leaving Eleanor standing in the entrance with the gift in her hands and moisture prickling at the corners of her eyes. She was not entirely alone after all. Reverend Whitmore came on an afternoon in early November. He was a tall, thin man with a face like a disappointed hatchet and opinions that he shared whether anyone wanted them or not. He had made his concerns known throughout the town. The Holbrook widow was engaging in unnatural practices, living in a cave like an animal, attempting to grow crops underground like some kind of pagan witch. He stood at the cave entrance with his Bible clutched to his chest, his breath making clouds in the cold air. "Mrs. Holbrook," his voice carried the weight of moral authority, "I have come out of concern for your immortal soul. This life you are leading, this dwelling in darkness, this attempt to force nature against God's design. It is not the path the Lord intended for his children." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment before responding. "With respect, Reverend," she finally said, "God made this cave. He put water inside it and light at its center and walls that hold warmth. When the world outside turns to ice, I am only using what he provided." Whitmore's thin lips pressed tighter. "That is dangerous reasoning, Mrs. Holbrook. You are teaching your children to live as outcasts. What kind of future do you imagine for them?" "The kind where they survive," Eleanor replied. "I will take my chances with the Lord's judgment." She turned and walked back into the darkness, leaving the Reverend standing at the entrance with his undelivered sermon and his impotent disapproval. The days passed in a rhythm of patient waiting. Each morning, Eleanor checked the soil's moisture by pressing her fingers into the dark earth. She used a small cup to transfer water from the seep in the wall to the beds, giving each inch of soil exactly what it needed. Not too much, which would rot any seeds that tried to sprout. Not too little, which would leave them dormant and dry. Just enough to sustain the potential for life in the darkness. During the hours when direct sunlight streamed through the crack above, she would sit near the beds and watch, a silent guardian of the impossible garden. The light fell in a golden column illuminating the dark soil, and she studied every inch of it for signs of change. When the sunbeam passed each day, she would light the lantern and move it slowly along the rows. The artificial light was weak compared to the sun, but every bit helped. Every hour of illumination increased the chances that something would grow. She found herself talking to the plants as she worked. "Grow," she murmured. "Please grow. Grow for my children. Grow for Silas. Grow because I need you to." She knew it was foolish, speaking to seeds buried in dirt. But in the silence of the cave, her voice was the only human sound. And the act of speaking made her feel less alone. 20 days passed, then 30. The soil remained dark and still. Doubt crept in like water through cracks in stone. Perhaps the seeds were dead. Perhaps the conditions were wrong. Perhaps everyone was right and she was simply a mad woman wasting the last weeks of her life on an impossible dream. She began to prepare herself for failure, for the long, cold winter that would follow, for choices that no mother should ever have to make. 35 days, 37, 39, nothing. On the 40th day, Eleanor knelt beside the beds as she did every morning. The sunbeam had just begun its daily journey across the chamber floor. Golden light spilled over her shoulder as she leaned close to examine the soil. And there it was, a tiny, pale spike no bigger than her smallest fingernail, pushing up through the dark earth, fragile as a prayer, stubborn as hope. She fell forward onto her hands. Her fingers trembled as she reached out to touch the tender leaf. It was real. It was alive. It had grown from a seed she planted in a cave underground, in a place where everyone said nothing could survive. Her shoulders began to shake. Her breath came in ragged gasps. The release that swept through her was overwhelming. Months of grief and fear and desperate labor breaking loose all at once. She pressed her hand over her mouth to muffle the sounds escaping her throat. Gideon found her there a few minutes later. He stood at the edge of the planting beds, looking at the tiny green shoot. And his face changed in ways Eleanor would remember for the rest of her life. The hard mask cracked. The boy who had been forcing himself to be a man let out a sound that was equal parts grief and joy. His composure finally shattered. He sank down beside his mother, his shoulders heaving, his face pressed against her arm. "Papa was right," he choked out. "He was right, Mama. It works." She pulled him close and held him while the weight of months lifted just enough to let them breathe. Bramble whined and pushed his nose against their legs. Cora came running to see what all the fuss was about. When the little girl saw the tiny plant, she clapped her hands and laughed with pure delight. "Look, Mama." The corn woke up. More shoots followed over the coming days, pushing up through the soil in a ragged green line. Then the stalks began to grow, reaching toward the light that streamed through the crack above. The plants were pale, much lighter than field corn grown under open sky. They stretched upward with an almost desperate urgency, every leaf oriented toward the precious sunbeam. Cora called them ghost corn, and the name stuck. To any normal farmer, the plants would have looked sickly, etiolated, and strange. But Eleanor saw them differently. She saw survivors. She saw adaptation. She saw life finding a way in impossible circumstances. The corn matured through the autumn weeks with quiet determination. The stalks thickened. The leaves broadened. Small ears began to form where the plants met the light. Everything was smaller than it would have been in a proper field, paler, more fragile, but it was growing. The first real test came in late October. A cold snap swept down from the north, dropping overnight temperatures to 15 degrees below zero. Frost painted the scrubland outside in glittering white. Shallow puddles turned to solid ice. The last brown leaves fell from the skeletal bushes and lay like brittle paper on the frozen ground. Inside the cave, nothing changed. The massive limestone walls held their constant warmth. Indifferent to the freeze outside, the temperature remained stable and mild while the world above locked itself in ice. Eleanor stood at the cave entrance that morning and watched her breath plume white in the frigid air. Then she turned and walked back to her planting beds, where the ghost corn stood green and growing in conditions that should have been lethal. She thought about Vernon Sutfield scrambling to protect his livestock from the sudden freeze, about Clem Jessup losing animals because he had not prepared properly, about the women in town huddled close to their stoves and complaining about the price of firewood. They were struggling out there. She was thriving in here. The harvest began in the third week of November. Eleanor picked the first ear of corn with the reverence usually reserved for sacred objects. She peeled back the husk slowly, layer by layer. revealing the rows of kernels beneath. They were not golden yellow like normal corn. They were pale, milky white, almost luminous in the lamplight, like kernels carved from bone or pearl. Ghost corn, Cora whispered, peering over her mother's shoulder. I told you, Mama. Eleanor cooked it that night over a small fire at the cave entrance. The taste was unlike anything she had expected. Sweet and earthy and complex in ways that sun-grown corn never achieved. The lack of full light had concentrated the sugar somehow, intensified the flavors. It was not better than regular corn. It was simply different. Its own thing entirely. It was survival made edible. She harvested the rest of the crop over the following days. Each ear was examined and husked and laid out on flat stones to dry. When she finished counting, she had 47 ears. Not a large harvest, a fraction of what she could have grown in a proper field under open sky. But it was enough to supplement the beans and eggs, enough to make cornmeal that would stretch through the winter months. The sight of that small, pale mountain of corn was more beautiful to her than any sunset. It was food. It was warmth. It was her answer to the courthouse and the smug faces and the laughter in the general store. Old Matthias came again as November drew to a close. He stood at the edge of the planting beds with his gnarled hands folded over his walking stick, studying the harvested corn with an expression Eleanor could not quite read. You did it, he said finally. The crazy widow grew corn in a cave. The words might have sounded mocking from anyone else. From Matthias they carried a tone of benediction. The old man looked up at the crack in the ceiling, then at the water seeping down the wall, then at the raised beds of dark earth. In the old country, he said quietly, we knew things, things that people here have forgotten. The earth remembers even when men choose not to. He turned to face her directly. You have remembered Frau Holbrook. That is good. That is very good. He moved toward the entrance and then paused, looking back with eyes that seemed to see something beyond the stone walls. There is weather coming. I feel it in my bones, a bad storm, the kind that comes perhaps once in 20 years. He tapped his stick against the stone floor. You will be safe in here. The others will not be so fortunate. Then he was gone, shuffling away across the frozen ground, leaving Eleanor with a warning she did not fully understand. The signs came slowly at first. Birds left early. Whole flocks of geese abandoned the valley weeks ahead of their normal schedule, their formations ragged and urgent against the gray November sky. Deer moved down from the high country in numbers Eleanor had never witnessed, dozens of them streaming past the cave entrance, their eyes wide with instinct that humans had long forgotten how to read. Bramble grew restless. The dog paced constantly now, whining at sounds Eleanor could not hear. His ears would prick at nothing. His nose would test the wind as if searching for a scent not yet present, but approaching. The sky turned a color that defied naming. Not quite gray, not quite yellow. Something in between that felt wrong on a level deeper than sight. Eleanor began preparing for whatever was coming. She stacked extra firewood near the cave entrance, filled every container with water from the seep in case something disrupted the flow, reinforced the heavy wooden barrier she had built across the opening, bracing it with stones so it would hold against wind and weight. Gideon helped without being asked. The boy had learned to read his mother's moods. And he recognized the urgency in her movements. Is it going to be bad? He asked one evening as they worked. Eleanor looked at the bruised and swollen sky. Yes, she said. I think it will be very bad indeed. The storm arrived on December 23rd, 1887. It did not come gradually. It attacked. One moment the sky hung heavy and threatening, but still. The next moment, a wall of white came screaming down from the north like the wrath of every winter god ever imagined. The wind struck first, a howling blast that nearly knocked Eleanor off her feet as she rushed to secure the entrance. Then the snow came, not falling but flying horizontal, driven by winds that shrieked and tore at everything in their path. Visibility dropped to nothing in seconds. The world disappeared behind a curtain of white so absolute that Eleanor could not see her own hand at arm's length. She got the barrier closed just as the full force hit. Inside the cave, the roar of the storm faded to a distant, muffled howl. The massive weight of stone above transformed the blizzard's fury into something almost peaceful, a battle raging in another world entirely. For 3 days, the storm held the land in its grip. Outside was chaos and death. Wind speeds reached 70 miles per hour. Temperatures plunged to 40 degrees below zero. Snow piled in drifts 20 feet deep. Roofs collapsed under the weight. Livestock froze where they stood. Anyone caught in the open died within minutes. Inside the cave, Eleanor sat with her children beside a small fire and listened to the apocalypse happening somewhere far away. The contrast was absolute. Out there, a maelstrom capable of killing anything it touched. In here, stability and warmth. Out there, people dying. In here, Cora asking for a bedtime story. Eleanor told her about Silas, about how he had found this cave and recognized what it could become, about how he was still protecting them even though he had gone ahead to whatever came next, about how the ghost corn they had grown came from his belief that impossible things could be achieved through patience and hard work. Cora listened with wide eyes and fell asleep with her head in her mother's lap. Gideon stared into the flames and did not sleep at all. The wind died on the fourth day. The silence that followed was more profound than any sound, an absolute stillness that pressed against the ears like held breath. Eleanor pushed open the barrier and stepped outside. The world had transformed completely. Where scrubland and rock had been, there were now only smooth, undulating waves of white stretching to the horizon in every direction. The snow had buried everything. Trees that had stood 20 feet tall were reduced to small mounds. Fences had vanished entirely. The landscape looked like a frozen ocean, its swells and hollows carved by winds that had raged for 72 straight hours. The sky above was steel gray and utterly motionless. Nothing moved anywhere. It was as if the world had ended and been replaced by this white, silent emptiness. Then she heard something in the distance, a voice, faint and desperate, calling for help. A figure appeared on the ridge above the cave, a man struggling forward through drifts that reached his waist, waving his arms, stumbling and falling and dragging himself up again. As he came closer, Eleanor recognized him. Vernon Sootfield, the man who had mocked her in the general store, the man who had laughed at her planting corn in a cave, the man who had said a rock slide would have done her a favor. He was not laughing now. His face was gaunt and gray with exhaustion. His clothes were torn. His eyes held the wild, desperate look of an animal caught in a trap. Behind him, barely visible through the snow, came his wife, Patience, the woman who had spread rumors and shaken her head with theatrical pity. She was stumbling, held upright only by her husband's grip on her arm, and behind her came their son Ezra, 10 years old, his small form almost invisible against the white landscape. Eleanor Vernon gasped as he reached the cave entrance. His voice was a ruined croak. "We saw your smoke. We did not know if you could possibly." He could not finish. His barn roof had collapsed on the second day. His winter stores were ruined. His livestock were dead. His house was buried so deep in snow the doors would not open. They had not eaten in 4 days. "Please," he whispered. The words seemed to cost him everything he had left. Then his knees buckled, and Vernon Sutfield sank into the snow before her. The man who had mocked her was kneeling at the entrance to the cave he had called her grave. Eleanor looked down at him. She looked at Patience, barely conscious on her feet. She looked at young Ezra, shivering in clothes too thin for this cold. She thought about the mockery, the cruelty, the laughter in the general store, the rumors Patience had spread, the bets Clem Jessup had taken on her death. She could say no. She had every right to say no. These people had shown her no kindness when she had nothing. They had wished her dead. They had treated her as a fool and an outcast and a madwoman. The power had shifted completely now, and Eleanor Holbrook had to decide what to do with it. Eleanor looked at Vernon Sutfield kneeling in the snow. She looked at his wife, Patience, barely conscious, swaying on feet that had carried her through miles of frozen wasteland. The woman who had whispered about Eleanor's madness in the general store. The woman who had collected gossip about the cave widow like precious coins. She looked at their son Ezra, 10 years old, shivering in clothes too thin for this brutal cold. His lips blue, his eyes glazed with exhaustion and fear. The moment stretched like cold honey. Every cruel word she had endured in that store came flooding back. Every smirk, every pitying shake of the head, every whispered prediction of her failure and death. She could say no. She had every right to say no. These people had shown her no kindness when she had nothing. They had laughed at her desperation. They had wagered on her death. They had watched her walk away with seed corn and lamp oil and done nothing but mock her foolishness. Now they were kneeling before her, begging for the very thing they had said was impossible. The irony was almost too perfect. Eleanor felt something dark and bitter rise in her chest. A voice that whispered of justice, of revenge served cold as the wind that had nearly killed them, of turning her back and walking into the warmth while they froze outside. It would be so easy, just close the barrier, return to her children, let the storm finish what their cruelty had started. No one would blame her. No one would even know, but then she thought of Silas. She thought of the man who had worked himself to death in a quarry to pay bills that were not his fault. The man who had explored this cave and seen its potential. The man who had left her a note because he could not bear the thought of her facing hardship without a plan. What would Silas do? The answer came immediately. Without doubt, without hesitation, Silas would help them. Not because they deserved it, not because they had earned it, but because that was who he was. Because strength meant nothing if it was only used to protect yourself. Because mercy was not a reward for good behavior, but a gift freely given. She thought of her mother too, a woman dead now for 15 years. A woman who had raised Eleanor with words that suddenly rang clear as church bells in her memory. Strength is not having power over others. Strength is knowing what to do with power when you finally have it. Eleanor looked at Ezra shivering in the snow. A boy the same age as her own children. A boy who had done nothing wrong except be born to parents who made poor choices. Could she let a child freeze to death to punish his father? Could she live with herself if she did? The answer was no. But she would not give them charity either. Eleanor stepped forward. Her boots crunched in the fresh snow. She looked down at Vernon, still kneeling. His eyes red-rimmed and desperate. His pride shattered into pieces smaller than the ice crystals swirling around them. I cannot feed the whole town, she said. Her voice was flat, practical, empty of either warmth or cruelty. Vernon's face crumpled. But I can trade. His head came up, confusion cutting through the desperation. Today, Eleanor nodded. 1 week of cornmeal for 1 month of firewood, cut and stacked and ready to burn. When you are able, when the snow clears. It was not charity, it was not a handout, it was a transaction, an exchange between equals, a deal that preserved dignity on both sides. Vernon stared at her for a long moment, processing what she had offered, understanding slowly dawning in his exhausted eyes. She was not saving him out of pity. She was doing business with him. The distinction mattered more than he could articulate. It meant he could accept her help without surrendering the last shreds of his self-respect. It meant he would owe her labor rather than gratitude. It meant they were making an agreement rather than her bestowing mercy. He nodded once, twice, tears freezing on his weathered cheeks before they could fall. Thank you, he breathed. The words came out cracked and broken. Thank you, Mrs. Holbrook. Eleanor stepped aside and gestured toward the cave entrance. Get inside, warm yourselves. We will sort out the details later. The Sutfields stumbled past her into the darkness. Vernon supporting Patience. Ezra following close behind on legs that could barely hold him upright. Bramble watched them enter with suspicious eyes, but he did not growl. Perhaps he sensed that these people were no longer threats. Perhaps he understood that survival had rewritten the rules of their small world. They were not the last to come. Over the following hours, more figures appeared on the white horizon, struggling through drifts, following the thin column of smoke that rose from Eleanor's fire, drawn to the only sign of life in a landscape of death. Clem Jessup arrived with his young wife Martha and their 2 small children. The man who had wagered $5 on Eleanor's death could barely meet her eyes as he stood at the cave entrance, his arrogance stripped away by 3 days of terror. She offered him the same terms she had offered Vernon. Labor for food, work for survival, he accepted without hesitation. The Henderson family came next, Thomas and Sarah and their 4 children. The youngest was a baby barely 6 months old, wrapped in a blanket too thin for the cold. The oldest was Emma, 7 years old, silent as a ghost. The girl had not spoken since the storm began. The trauma of nearly freezing to death, combined with the fear and confusion of being uprooted from everything familiar, had locked something inside her. She would not talk. She barely ate. She sat in corners with her arms wrapped around her knees and stared at the stone walls. Harlan Brenner came, the storekeeper who had watched her humiliation with cold indifference. Now he stood before her looking at the underground farm with undisguised astonishment. "I have candles," he said, "and lamp oil, and salt. I will trade for meal. Whatever you think is fair." Eleanor nodded and let him pass. Dr. Ephraim Locke came, having made the dangerous journey through snow still waist-deep in places. He carried his medical bag clutched to his chest like a talisman. He had patients in town, people who needed treatment, but his office was buried. His supplies were ruined. He had come seeking shelter like everyone else. More families arrived as the day wore on, each one desperate, each one humbled, each one willing to trade whatever they had for a share of Eleanor's impossible harvest. By nightfall, 17 people sheltered in the cave. Eleanor organized them with the same practical efficiency she had applied to building planting beds. Each family received a section of the cave for sleeping. Blankets were shared according to need. Food was rationed carefully. The fire at the entrance was kept burning constantly. More for light and morale than for warmth, since the cave maintained its own stable temperature regardless of what happened outside. The days that followed became a strange kind of community. People who had never spoken before found themselves sharing meals and stories. Children from different families played together while their exhausted parents rested. Old grievances were set aside because survival required cooperation. There was no room for petty feuds when everyone depended on everyone else. The ghost corn stretched further than Eleanor had imagined possible. Ground into meal and mixed with water, it became a simple porridge that filled bellies and sustained life. The eggs from marigold and biscuit and pepper were divided among the children. The dried beans were added to soups that simmered constantly over the fire. No one went hungry. No one froze. No one died. Dr. Locke moved between the refugees, checking fingers and toes for frostbite, monitoring the baby Henderson for signs of illness, marveling openly at the conditions inside the cave. "The temperature in here," he said one evening, writing careful notes in a small book. "A 26-degree difference from outside. Remarkable. Someone should document this properly." He examined the planting beds with scientific curiosity, asked Eleanor detailed questions about her methods, listened with growing respect as she explained what she had discovered about the light and the water and the stable air. "This is not madness," he said finally. "This is innovation. You have created something here that could change how we think about agriculture entirely." Eleanor shook her head. "I was just trying to survive. Sometimes survival requires genius." Among those who came was young Ezra Sutfield, Vernon's 10-year-old son. The boy had a healing bruise on his cheek and eyes that reminded Eleanor of Gideon, the eyes of a child being forced to grow up too fast. He stood apart from his parents at first, watching the cave's interior with undisguised wonder. "Is this where you grew the ghost corn?" he asked quietly. Eleanor nodded. "Can you teach me how?" It was such a simple question, but it carried the weight of something larger, a passing of knowledge from one generation to the next, the very thing that had brought her here in the first place. "Yes," she said, "I can teach you." Over the following days, Ezra became Gideon's shadow. The two boys worked side by side, hauling water from the seep, tending the small fire, helping wherever they could. They should have been enemies. Their fathers had been rivals. Their families had been on opposite sides of the mockery and judgment that had driven Eleanor to this place. But children do not inherit grudges as easily as adults imagine. They found common ground in the work, in the strangeness of their situation, in the shared experience of watching their worlds collapse and rebuild in unexpected ways. A friendship formed between them that would outlast everything else. On the 8th day, a small miracle occurred. Emma Henderson had been silent since arriving at the cave. The 7-year-old girl would not speak, would not play, would not respond to her mother's increasingly desperate attempts at comfort. She sat in her corner with her arms wrapped around her knees and stared at nothing. Dr. Locke had examined her and found no physical cause. "Sometimes the mind protects itself by retreating," he explained to Sarah Henderson. "She may return to us when she feels safe. We can only wait and hope." On the 8th day, Bramble walked over to where Emma sat. The dog had been busy during the crisis, moving between families, standing guard at the entrance. accepting grateful pats from children who found comfort in his steady presence. But something drew him to the silent girl. He sat down beside her, close but not touching, patient and still. For a long time, nothing happened. Emma stared at the wall. Bramble sat beside her. The cave continued its quiet life around them. Then so quietly that only those watching closely could hear Emma spoke. "Can I pet the dog?" Sarah Henderson's hand flew to her mouth. Tears spilled down her cheeks. Bramble moved closer and placed his graying head in the girl's lap. Emma's small fingers came down to stroke his fur. And for the first time since the storm began, she smiled. It was a small moment in the larger story of survival and disaster. But everyone who witnessed it understood they had seen something important. The healing had begun. The apologies came gradually. Some people are quick to admit when they are wrong. Others need time to process their failures, to understand how completely their assumptions had collapsed, to find words adequate for the magnitude of their mistakes. Vernon Sutfield came to Eleanor on the 10th day. He found her checking the soil in the planting beds, preparing for what would need to happen when spring finally arrived. She heard his footsteps approach and continued her work without looking up. "Mrs. Holbrook." She straightened, wiped her hands on her worn dress, turned to face the man who had been her cruelest critic. Vernon stood with his hat crushed in his weathered hands. He looked older than he had 2 weeks ago. The storm had aged him in ways that went beyond the physical exhaustion still visible in his face. "I need to say something." Eleanor waited, her expression neutral, patient, giving him nothing. "I was wrong." 3 words hanging in the still air of the cave. "I called you crazy. I laughed at you in front of the whole town. I told everyone you would be dead by spring." He took a deep breath, the words coming harder now. "I was the fool, not you. You built the only thing that could have saved us. You saw what was coming, and you prepared. I saw nothing. I understood nothing." Eleanor studied his face. This was not the same man who had leaned against a barrel and drawled insults at her. That man had been confident in his superiority. This man had been broken by the storm and was trying to rebuild himself into something better. "What you did," Vernon continued, "taking us in when you had every reason to refuse, trading with us instead of turning us away, sharing what you knew instead of keeping it secret." He shook his head slowly. "I do not know if I would have done the same." "You would have," Eleanor said quietly. "Your children were hungry too. That is what parents do." Vernon was silent for a long moment. Then he extended his hand. "I would like to learn," he said. "Whatever you are willing to teach, I want to understand what you understand." Eleanor looked at the offered hand. This was the hand that had gestured dismissively at her in the store. The hand that had slapped a counter in amusement at her foolishness. The hand that had pointed at her as an example of what happened when women tried to survive without men. She took it. They shook once, firmly, an agreement sealed without words. It was more meaningful than any apology could have been. Reverend Whitmore came later that same day. He stood at the cave entrance with his Bible still clutched to his chest, but his face had lost its rigid disapproval. The storm had taught everyone humility, even men who claimed to speak for God. "Mrs. Holbrook, I told you this was not God's way. I was wrong." Eleanor raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "God gave you wisdom," the Reverend continued. "Wisdom I was too blind to recognize. You saved lives here. You showed mercy to those who showed you none." He looked into the cave at the planting beds visible in the pale light from the crack above. "Perhaps this place is more sacred than any church I have ever stood in." It was as close to an apology as Josiah Whitmore was capable of giving. Eleanor accepted it with a nod and let him pass. Clem Jessup came last of all. The young man who had wagered on her death found her alone at the cave entrance one afternoon. The snow was finally beginning to settle. The worst of the danger had passed. People were starting to talk about returning to their damaged homes. He walked up with something in his hand, a small cloth bag that clinked when he moved. $5, he said without preamble. "I bet $5 you would not survive until spring." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "I was cruel," Clem continued. "Stupid and cruel. I thought it was funny. I thought you were just a mad widow who would freeze in that cave and prove everyone right about how foolish you were." He held out the bag. "This is the money. I'm giving it to you. It cannot undo what I did. But it is something." Eleanor took the bag, felt the weight of the coins inside. $5 was not nothing. $5 was food for weeks, supplies for months. I'm not asking forgiveness, Clem said. I know I do not deserve it. He turned and walked away without waiting for a response. Eleanor stood at the entrance for a long time after, feeling the weight of the coins in her hand, thinking about justice and mercy and all the complicated spaces between them. She had not forgiven him. She was not sure she ever would, but she had let him give what he could, and perhaps that was enough. The crisis lasted 3 weeks. By the time the snow had settled enough for travel and the temperatures had climbed to merely brutal, rather than lethal, the community in the cave had become something new. Bonds had formed in the darkness. Debts had been created and repaid. A different economy had emerged, based on trade and mutual aid rather than competition and isolation. When the refugees finally left to return to their damaged homes, they did not leave empty-handed. They left with knowledge. 7 families began digging storage cellars that spring, copying the principles Eleanor had demonstrated, creating underground spaces for food preservation that would keep vegetables fresh through the coldest of months. 12 families started composting systems based on her methods, mixing kitchen scraps with ash and soil to create rich fertilizer for their gardens. 3 families began planning cave expansions, finding limestone formations on their own property, studying them with new eyes. The woman who had been mocked as crazy had become the most important teacher in the county. The seasons turned. Spring came slowly that year. The snow lingered late into April. But when it finally melted, the world that emerged was different from the one the blizzard had buried. Eleanor expanded her underground garden, adding more beds, experimenting with different crops, learning what would grow in the filtered light and what required more sun. Gideon worked beside her, learning everything she could teach, growing taller and stronger with each passing month. The hard mask he had worn since his father's death gradually softened, not disappearing entirely but making room for other expressions. Laughter sometimes, wonder occasionally, hope more often than before. Cora grew too. The little girl who had named the chickens and called the corn ghost corn was becoming someone remarkable. She had her mother's stubbornness and her father's gentle curiosity. She asked questions constantly about the cave and the crops and the world beyond the Badlands. She started helping with the teaching. When other children came to learn about underground farming, it was often Cora who showed them how to plant seeds and check soil moisture. She had a gift for explaining complicated things in simple ways. Bramble remained their faithful guardian. His muzzle grew grayer with each passing year. His steps grew slower, but his loyalty never wavered. He still patrolled the cave entrance, still slept beside Cora each night, still watched over his family with those intelligent, brown eyes that seemed to understand everything. Vernon Sutfield kept his word about the firewood. When spring arrived, he came with his wagon and his axes, and he worked for a month straight, cutting and splitting and stacking wood against the cave entrance, more than enough to last through 3 winters. He came back the following year too, not because he owed anything, but because he wanted to learn more. He asked questions, took notes, applied what he learned to his own farm. The friendship between Ezra and Gideon deepened over the years. They became as close as brothers, hunting together in the high country the way Silas had once promised to take Gideon, helping each other with chores, sharing the burdens of growing up in a hard land. Old Matthias died in the spring of 1889. They found him in his cabin, sitting in his chair, a cup of cold tea on the table beside him, a peaceful expression on his weathered face. Eleanor attended the burial, one of only a handful who did. She stood at the grave and remembered the old man's kindness, his gifts of wood ash and wisdom, his warnings that had probably saved her life. The old ways work when the new ways fail. She carried those words with her for the rest of her days. Bramble died in the spring of 1898. He was 14 years old, ancient for a working dog. He had been slowing down for months, sleeping more, walking less, his eyes growing cloudy with age. On his last day, he managed to complete his patrol of the cave entrance, one final circuit of the territory he had guarded for so long. Then he came inside and lay down beside Eleanor. She stroked his graying fur while the light from the crack above moved slowly across the chamber floor. "Good boy," she whispered. "You can rest now. Silas is waiting for you." Bramble closed his eyes. His breathing slowed, and between one heartbeat and the next, he was gone. They buried him near the cave entrance beneath a stone that Gideon carved with steady hands. Bramble, faithful through every season. Eleanor wept that day for the first time in many years. Then she dried her eyes and returned to her work. There was always more to do. The years accumulated like layers of soil in the planting beds, each one adding depth and richness to the life Eleanor had built. Gideon grew into a man who carried his father's quiet strength and his mother's determination. He studied agriculture at the Territorial College, though his real education had come from the darkness of a limestone cave. His writings on underground climate stability were considered radical at first. Professors dismissed them. Established farmers laughed. The academic world was not ready to take seriously the theories of a young man from the Badlands. But within 2 decades, his work was being cited in textbooks across the nation. Scientists began studying caves with new interest. Architects considered underground structures for applications beyond mining and storage. He married a school teacher named Sarah, who had heard the cave farmer story and wanted to meet the family. She found in Eleanor not just a mother-in-law, but a mentor, a woman who had proven that impossible things could be achieved through stubbornness and hope. They raised 4 children who learned to plant ghost corn before they learned to ride horses. Cora became a teacher herself. She taught the children of Cooperton not just reading and arithmetic, but the stories of their community. How it had nearly perished in the Great Blizzard. How it had been reborn in a cave. How her mother had proven that impossible things were possible for those stubborn enough to try. She married Ezra Sutfield in the spring of 1901. Their wedding was held at the cave entrance, with Eleanor's blessing and the whole community in attendance. Vernon Sutfield stood beside his son with tears streaming down his face, not from sadness, but from wonder at how completely the world could change. 2 families that had once been enemies were now joined by love. Silas would have smiled at that. Eleanor remained in the cave. What had begun as refuge had become home. She could not imagine living anywhere else. The constant temperature suited her aging joints. The filtered light was gentle on her weakening eyes. The sound of water dripping into the basin was the most peaceful music she knew. Her hair turned silver. Her hands grew more gnarled. But she never stopped working. Never stopped teaching anyone who came to learn. Never stopped adding to the knowledge she would leave behind. She kept Silas's note folded in her pocket until the paper nearly fell apart. Then she copied it carefully onto fresh pages and stored the original in a metal box near the place where she had first found it. His words would outlast them both. Eleanor Holbrook died in the winter of 1912. She was 63 years old. She passed peacefully in her sleep in the cave that had saved her life and become her legacy, surrounded by the walls that had sheltered her through 25 winters. Gideon and Cora were both there at the end. They held her hands while she drifted in and out of consciousness. They told her stories about her grandchildren and the farm and the community that had grown around her teachings. They promised her that everything she had built would continue, that her knowledge would be passed down, that she would not be forgotten. In her final moments, she opened her eyes one last time. "Silas," she whispered, "I kept them safe." Then she was gone. The funeral was the largest Cooperton had ever seen. People came from miles in every direction. Farmers and teachers and doctors and merchants. People who had sheltered in her cave during the Great Storm, and people who knew the story only secondhand. They stood in the cold March wind and listened to Reverend Whitmore speak about a woman who had shown them what was possible. She planted where no one believed anything could grow, he said. Not just corn in a cave, but hope in despair, community in isolation, love in the face of cruelty. They buried her beside Silas beneath the oak tree that had somehow survived both the Great Blizzard and all the years since. The same tree that had sheltered 3 generations of Holbrooks. The same earth that held her husband and his father before him. Her headstone was carved from limestone, taken from the cave itself. The words on it said what needed saying. She planted where no one believed anything could grow. But the story did not end there. In 1978, a team of researchers from Montana State University came to investigate the Holbrook Cave. They had read the old accounts in regional archives, scientific papers that mentioned Eleanor's methods in passing, agricultural histories that treated her as a curious footnote. They wanted to verify the claims with modern instruments. What they discovered astonished the scientific community. Deep in the cave, they found journals that Gideon had kept, preserved in the stable air for decades. Detailed records of temperature and humidity and crop yields spanning 40 years. Meticulous observations that would have impressed any modern agricultural scientist. They rebuilt Eleanor's original planting beds exactly as she had designed them. Set up monitoring equipment, planted seeds, waited. The results confirmed everything the old stories claimed. The temperature inside the cave fluctuated by only 3 degrees throughout the entire year, 52 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of conditions outside. The same stability Eleanor had relied on nearly a century before. The humidity remained constant. The air quality was excellent. The light from the crack above provided exactly enough illumination for certain crops during peak growing months. It was an almost perfect environment for controlled agriculture. The principles she had discovered independently, the researchers realized were being applied in modern passive house design. The same concepts guided construction of the Amundsen Scott Research Station at the South Pole. The same thermodynamics informed contemporary thinking about sustainable architecture. A widow with nothing but determination in her dead husband's notes had pioneered techniques that the most advanced architects of the 20th century were only beginning to understand. The papers published about the Holbrook Cave were cited hundreds of times over the following decades. Agricultural scientists, climate engineers, sustainable design experts, all of them referenced the work of a woman who had been called mad for planting corn underground. The cave was designated a Montana Historic Site in 1984. Today, hundreds of visitors come each year to walk through the chambers and hear the story of the woman who refused to surrender. They see the planting beds she built with her bare hands. They drink from the spring she discovered. They stand in the beam of light that falls through the crack in the ceiling. They come not just to see a cave. They come to remember that sometimes the places others dismiss as worthless contain everything needed for survival. And sometimes the people the world abandons are the ones who see most clearly. There is a lesson in Eleanor Holbrook's story that reaches across all the years since she first walked through that dark entrance with nothing but a lantern and a desperate hope. It is not a lesson about farming. It is not a lesson about caves. It is a lesson about what human beings are capable of when they refuse to accept the verdict the world passes on them. We all face caves in our lives, moments when the gavel comes down and everything we built falls apart. Moments when the people around us shake their heads and predict our failure. Moments when the darkness seems absolute and the path forward seems impossible. Eleanor stood at the mouth of that darkness and she stepped through, not because she knew what waited on the other side, but because standing still was not an option. She planted seeds in stone and watered them with tears and tended them with hands that bled and healed and bled again. And she harvested something that fed not just her children, but an entire community. Not just for one winter, but for generations. Her message across all these years is simple. When they tell you the ground is worthless, look harder. When they tell you nothing can grow, they're dig deeper. When they laugh at your plans, work longer. When they predict your failure, prove them wrong. Plant anyway, in the darkest place you can find. With whatever seeds you have, water them with whatever hope remains, and wait. Because sometimes the ghost corn grows. Sometimes the impossible harvest comes. Sometimes the mad woman wins.